Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Twitter followers probably know right now about poor Zoe had 18 teeth pulled out. We will talk about all of that another time, but she's okay. I'm okay. There's all that kind of stuff. Instead, we're going to get right to it. We have a delightful guest today. I get all this grief from people who say I have an exciting guest today, so I'm trying to find up other superlatives. So I don't want anyone to think that I'm not excited about this guest. I'm also working on very little sleep because I was up with the poor dingo. So Alexandra Hudson is an award-winning writer, an adjunct faculty member at Indiana University's Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and the curator of the newsletter Civic Renaissance. Her new book is The Soul of Civility, Timeless Principles to Heal Society and Ourselves. Alexandra, welcome to the Remnant.
Jonah, thank you for having me.
Okay, so first question I always ask of authors is, what's your book about?
Well, first of all, I'm so sorry about poor Zoe, and thanks for having me despite little sleep. I know how hard that is with two small children of my own. But my book is about the most important question of our day, which is how might we flourish across deep difference? And what does that look like in our own divided moment? While I was writing my book, The Soul of Civility, I wrote it after I had emerged from a very toxic time in public life. And I was in federal government, 2017 to 2018. And I started writing this book. And what I realized is that this is not actually a new question. We hear a lot of thoughtful people decry our moment right now as uniquely divided, uniquely rude, uniquely savage and barbaric. Yet I discovered that most eras tend to feel like they're living through the most uncivil, the most savage, the most barbaric moment of civilizational decline. And this question of how might we flourish across deep difference is the defining question of liberal democracy, the classical liberal project, of the democratic project, of the human social project. This is the question of our species. How do we overcome the self-love in our nature and flourish and let our social facets develop, as I talk about in the book? There's a duality to our nature. We're profoundly social as a species. We become fully human in relationship with others. And yet morally and biologically, we're driven to meet our own needs before others. And those two facets of ourself, of our nature, are in tension. And that is why this joint project of living well with others in friendship, in community, and civilization and a democracy is precarious. It is always fragile, and it always has been, our own moment included. And so my book is about how to sustain this joint project of living well with others, and the stuff of the good life. How do we achieve the stuff of the good life, even with the myriad epiphenomena that we are all very familiar with, such as our ubiquitous media culture, social media. Other novel facets of modernity that do pose unique challenges to this challenge of civility, but it is a timeless question.
So, just to do some level setting, I think I know the answer, but when you meet someone who says, "Oh, you wrote a book, what's it about?" And then they ask you, "Well, what's the difference between civility and politeness?" How do you answer that?
So I came to my interest in this topic of social norms and manners. Honestly, my mother, she's called Judy the Manners Lady. So I was raised in this home that was very attentive to manners and social norms and expectations. While writing this book, tiny footnote, I came to discover that my mother is one of 4 women who are internationally renowned experts on manners and etiquette who are named Judy. There are 4 of them. I think it's like a generational thing. The most famous is probably Miss Manners, the Washington Post columnist Judith Martin, but my mother is one of 3 others on top of that. So my mother is unbelievably gracious and hospitable and kind. She embodies the soul of true civility, just transforming the outsider to the insider, stranger into a friend. Our home growing up was a revolving door of newcomers to our community, immigrants, homestays, and she's just zealous about the human social project, and she cares about manners to the extent that they support the human social enterprise. She also taught us to mind our P's and Q's, how to set the table, how to cut our food. I'm constitutionally allergic to authority. That's part of why I am a classical liberal and dispositionally conservative. And so I remember always questioning these rules and driving my mother crazy. I hungered to know why. And I wanted a moral foundation, an understanding of where these norms and expectations came from. Was it just because somewhere, someplace, sometime decided we should do it this way? And was that sufficient for why we should do it now? But my mother promised that following these rules of propriety would serve me well in work and school and life. And she was right until I got to federal government. I was at the U.S. Department of Education with Secretary DeVos. And for reasons that had nothing to do with DeVos, it was just the nature of government, the nature of our divided moment. It was a very dispiriting experience. I saw these two extremes. On one hand, I saw these people, this contingent of people who were willing to, they were hostile and abrasive, but they were willing to bully and step on anyone to get ahead and get what they wanted. And on the other hand, there was this contingent that I first thought was my contingent. They were polished and poised and polite, yet these were the people that would smile at me one moment, flatter me one moment, and stab me in the back the next. And this really puzzled me, because one thing my mother had said growing up was that manners mattered because they were an outward extension of our inward character. And here I was surrounded by people who were well-mannered enough, yet ruthless and cruel. And so this clarified for me several things, one of which was this essential distinction between civility and politeness. This experience clarified for me that politeness is we hear people use these words interchangeably all the time, but they're actually very different. Politeness is manners, it's etiquette, it's external, it's behavior, it's technique. Civility is internal. It's a disposition of the heart. It's a way of seeing others as our moral equals who are worthy of a bare minimum of respect just by virtue of the imago Dei, by virtue of our innate dignity as human beings. And that crucially, sometimes actually respecting someone requires breaking the rules of propriety, being impolite, telling a hard truth, engaging in robust debate. That so I think it's essential that we disambiguate civility and politeness in our modern language to help us clarify what we want more of and what we want less of in our public discourse now.
I like disambiguate, I got to tell you. So it's funny. I'm thinking about this. I grew up in New York City. I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And it's funny how, like, my mom wasn't Jewish. I was still raised Jewish. My mom came from a very Southern background where the forms were really important. And my dad came from the Bronx, where the substance was really important. And it's funny how the Jewish concept of mensch doesn't really get to manners, but it gets to your conception of civility, right? It's like you're a good person, but sometimes good people eat soup loudly, and they tell you uncomfortable truths, right? And so it's funny. I like this definition of civility because, I wrote this book, Suicide of the West, and where I keep trying to make this point over and over and over again that civilization doesn't just describe a geographic or cultural space. It's a process. On the Remnant bingo card, this line from Hannah Arendt, where every generation, Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children, is sort of central to like my whole spiel. And babies are barbarians. I mean, they're friggin' adorable. And I remember James Q. Wilson once had a great footnote where he said, social scientists have not spent enough time studying the concept of cuteness, because if babies weren't cute, we would not tolerate them. If they were gross reptilian things, like the hassle wouldn't be there. But so babies we come into this world with factory preset software, but we need updates. And I always make this argument that that's what we call civilization, right? We civilize barbarians into adult citizens. It's all the same Latin roots. It's all the same concept. Right. And manners, you can have I'm sure there are societies where their definition of good manners are horrifying. But it's just like an ethical code that everyone sort of agrees to. But civility, I think you're right, is much more deeply tied in the liberal project, rightly understood.
And I love etymology. I love the story and history of our language, of our words. It's not just fascinating, but it's also a fun kind of mnemonic. It's stories about, that help us remember things better. So the etymology of civility and politeness supports this distinction I make. The Latin root of politeness is polliere, which means to smooth or polish. It's external. That's what civility does. It focuses on the outside and it's superficial, polishes over difference, as opposed to giving us the tools to grapple with difference head on. The etymology of civility is, as you noted a moment ago, civitas. It's the civitas. My friend Spencer Clavin would correct me if he were here. That it's the Latin root of citizen, city, and citizenship, and of course, as you noted, civilization. And it's the conduct befitting a citizen in the city that again requires sometimes being impolite, especially in a democracy. Robust debate, disagreeing, risking offending people, is the lifeblood of our free and flourishing way of life. And it's understandable why people conflate these two ideas. Samuel Johnson, in his 1755 dictionary, the first dictionary of the English language, he defined civility in terms of politeness in terms of civility. And we've been doing it for all his virtue, as I love Johnson, but for all his virtues, we've been doing it wrong ever since, is kind of my argument in the book. If you go to dictionary.com right now, you'll see an entry in civility in terms of politeness in terms of civility. And today we have these two contingents. On one hand, there are people we hear people say we're so divided right now, and we need more civility and comity and gentility, and they harken back to this golden era of harmony in public life, and we just need more civility and politeness to help us do life together now. And then we have this other contingent that says no, civility and politeness are part of the problem. They're tools of white supremacists, of the patriarchy, of people in positions of power to keep the powerless powerless. So we need less civility and politeness in public life. We need to burn it all down for the name of justice and equality and social progress. And what both these contingents miss is this essential distinction between civility and politeness that is central to my book and central to what I think we need right now. And I love that you said that, you have this one foot in Southern culture. I just got back on book tour from North Carolina. The motto of North Carolina is esse quam videri, the Latin for to be rather than to seem, which is so funny because the South is known for this stereotypical sort of bless your heart culture. I don't know if that was part of your experience growing up in the South. I'm not sure where in the South you're from, but and of course the bless your heart culture is the archetype of politeness over civility, like saying one thing, oh bless your heart, but meaning like you're an idiot, like that inner discontinuity.
So what are some of the distinct tools of civility as distinct from politeness? I mean, other than telling hard truths, which, telling hard truths, I get the point. I agree with the point, but at the same time, it can't define civility because civility has to be more than that. Because otherwise the anti-civility people on the left and right will say, well, that's what we're doing. Right. So what are some of the other tools about that you think defines civility?
Well, two things. One is I reclaim the whole tradition of civil disobedience and this conception of civility that, yes, civility demands telling hard truths, engaging in a robust debate. Sometimes it requires protest. It demands action. And our country was founded on protest. It was founded on resistance and civil disobedience. So I draw from, I have a whole chapter on civil disobedience, drawing from Thoreau, Gandhi, Dr. King. And we can focus on Dr. King for a second, because in his conception of civil disobedience, he for anyone who wanted to be part of his peaceful, nonviolent resistance, I had to undergo this process called purification. And it was basically, purification was cultivating the disposition of civility. It was cultivating love and affection for the people who held bigoted views, whom they were protesting. And that informed, that required, that compelled them to protest, that compelled the letter writing campaigns, the sit-ins, the marches, because that was an act of love, saying, I respect you enough to confront you with your inaccurate view of the world and other human beings. But at the same time that civility demands action, compels it out of a basic respect for the personhood and dignity of others, it also takes certain action off the table. For example, violence, dehumanizing someone by destroying their property or person, or ad hominem attack. So there's that duality that civility both compels action and takes certain action off the table. Another example of civility in practice, I love Adam Smith. He has this great distinction between justice and beneficence. So justice is kind of this do no harm ethic. It's like a negative act. Like don't, you do you, I do me. And Smith says, we need justice in a society to survive. We people just not actively harming others, just, going their separate ways, and the sort of negative ethic. But we need beneficence to thrive. And beneficence is this old word that I think is due for a revival. That means act of goodness, like the sort of above and beyond, this supererogatory is this idea in Catholic theology of kind of bonus points. Things are like that are just like extra. And I have a whole chapter dedicated to hospitality that kind of encompasses this ethic of beneficence, this act of goodness that we need, not just to peacefully coexist, but to actually flourish as human beings in community together. So I call hospitality this high and noble expression of civility that we hear people say, we're less hospitable, we're less civil than we were in past eras. And I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but I do think that it's easier. We're not as codependent in our current moment. In past eras, like thousands of years, for most of human history, in fact, staying put was the norm and traveling was atypical. And now it's the inverse is true. We're always on the move. We're always, moving cities. We're always traveling about. For most of human history, traveling was a risky endeavor. You carried what money you had on you, and if you lost that, you were forlorn. Like if you were in need, you showed up at someone's home, knocked at the door, asked if you could stay there, and either they welcomed you, a complete stranger, into their home, or you died. And so across history and culture, I draw from many different ethical, religious, philosophical traditions. There is this vibrant concept of why we ought to show hospitality to the stranger in need, even though it's risky, mutually precarious, mutually risky. Because of our common humanity, because we don't know when we might, or someone we love might be down and out and in need. So I love the etymology of hospitality, for example. It's the Latin root hospice gives us our word hospitality. It also gives us our Latin root hostility, because that there's a duality to our nature and a duality of the hospitable enterprise. Like you as a stranger at someone's doorstep, going into someone's home, a complete stranger's home, as was very common through much of human history, that's a risky enterprise. You, as a host, welcoming a stranger into your home is a very risky enterprise. The Latin root hospice means stranger, friend, host, and guest. So we're united in this vulnerability of the hospitable enterprise that is kind of countercultural right now. We kind of prize invulnerability and safety and comfort in our current moment. So, and again, today we have things like credit cards. We have things like a vast network of hotels. Travel is easy and affordable, and we don't need to just show up on people's doorsteps. In order to, if we're in a strange city, we get stranded in a city, we just whip out our credit card and pay for a hotel that night. So we're less dependent today than we were in past eras. But I think that we are just as capable of hospitality as I've learned and researched.
So I'm a huge fan of, I'm a word guy. I know it doesn't sound like I am right now. I sound more like Homer Simpson saying, please pass thing scoop food with. You mean spoon, homie? Yes, but no. I like etymology. I'm a logophile. I do think it's an important distinction. Like when you say, because I want to probe this difference between politeness and civility thing a little deeper. But the like the Samuel Johnson thing, where it's the circular, one defines the other. They're treated as synonymous. I've been having this ongoing debate with many people I am not friends with, and a few people who I am friends with for a while now about the differences in the etymology of nationalism and patriotism. And I'm quite adamant that there's a real difference between the two. At the same time, it kind of doesn't matter if I'm wrong, because we need the words to describe the different things that we're talking about, right? So, like,
it's true.
Even if someone circles back on you and says, "Aha!" But if you go look at what Pliny the Elder wrote or what Cicero wrote, and it turns out that politeness and civility are the same, have the same thing, it doesn't. It's not like some magical spell that renders your argument irrelevant. It's like, oh, okay, so I'm wrong about the etymology. Who gives a rat's ass? We still need to talk about this thing that I'm describing as civility and this thing that I'm describing as politeness.
Yes.
And these things are different things, right? And
yes.
I'm not saying that you're in danger of having your etymological bona fides, erased, but it's sort of like, what was it? Was it King Charles during the Glorious Revolution? He thought that he could foil the usurpers, was it William of Orange, whatever, by taking the royal seal, which was necessary to pass any decrees or edicts, right? And he threw it in the Thames. And he was like, now they'll be powerless once they get on the throne because they don't have this magical talisman. They're like, nah, we'll just make another seal, right? I mean, like sometimes we have a real bad tendency in the eggheadosphere of treating things as words and words as things, and sometimes that can steer us around. So anyway, I just want to get that off of my head because my brain was itchy, and get to but also because so this definition of civility is sort of inherent to.
Can I jump in there for a second? So I love Samuel Johnson. He has this great line, speaking of patriotism, that I'm sure you know, that patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. He was not a fan of patriotism. He agreed with you that there was a difference between nationalism and patriotism. So, to your point about needing words to describe different things, you're absolutely right. And this is kind of the beauty of the English language. English is a descriptive language. So when Johnson set about to do this thing called, there's a great biography of Johnson and his dictionary called Defining the World, because that's what he did. He wanted to track down and define every single word in the spoken English language of his day. And when he did that, he didn't say, okay, how ought this word to be used? And let's define it accordingly. No, he said, how is this word used right now in my own era? That was his descriptive approach of language. He wanted the English dictionary to reflect the English as it was spoken. And that's very different from other languages. For example, French, the Académie Française in France, they consider themselves these custodians of French heritage and culture that is all embodied in their language. And so they say, I don't care how you use this word. This is its actual meaning. Like, they're totally inflexible. They're very hesitant to add new words to the French dictionary, for example. Because it is so emblematic of all that they value and their heritage and their culture. So this is the beauty of English, though. It is descriptive, and it always has been from Johnson and beyond. It's organic and it's adaptive. And I've identified what I think is an urgent need. We need to more clearly think about what we want more of and what we want less of in a society. And so I've brought to the English language this clarification, as others have done before me. We're allowed to do this. We're allowed to add new words. Shakespeare did it. Why can't we, and to define, not just being good, right back to North Carolina's motto, esse quam videre, not just to be good, but not just to seem good. What does it mean to actually be good? And what I think what we need more of now in this society of the spectacle that we live in, where we so prize, and I'm happy to talk about this as part of the book, the spectacular society, some fun stories there we could get into. But in this era that really prizes what appears versus what is, especially in this social media era, I think we need to focus on, what is and true respect for others, as opposed to just faux respect that politeness too often allows us to settle for.
All right. So just very briefly, my sort of shorthand history of liberalism, or how we got liberalism, is that, like, we had the wars of religion, where we kept trying, where all these different countries kept, or kingdoms or regimes kept trying to kill people who worshipped slightly differently than them. And that was a hot mess. And so finally, through exhaustion, they said, okay, maybe we shouldn't settle questions of conscience at the tip of a sword. We have to come up with something that creates some social space for people to have the right to be wrong about this, that, or the other thing. And it starts as a very narrow thing about, encouraging, about having tolerance for stray Protestant sects and whatnot. And or very quickly, but not the Catholics. And then over time, it grows and it gets more robust. And so, like in John Locke's Notes on Toleration, it's tolerate some Protestants, but not the Catholics. But by the time you get to Thomas Jefferson talking about these things, he's like, we have to have freedom for Hindus, Jews, pagans, Vikings, whatever, right? It's this, it takes the principle and it broadens out. And the other part of it, and I promise there won't be a lot of German on here, but I'm a Hayek guy, and Hayek has this big distinction between the microcosm and the macrocosm, or what he calls the Gesellschaft and the Gemeinschaft. And the Gemeinschaft is like the community, the people who know you as a human being, your friends, your family, your tribe, your community, whatever. And then there are certain rules in there that are different than the Gesellschaft, which is the extended order, the legal order, the market order. And the great thing about markets is it's the first system, successful system at least, that figures out a way for people to deal with strangers in a non-zero sum way that also doesn't lead to people getting beaten over the head with a rock. And so I'm just wondering, you may have a different Just So story about the rise of liberalism, but is the civility that you're talking about, is that discussed as the way, as part of this liberalism during this, this period 400 or 500 years ago, 300 to 500 years ago, depending on where you want to start the story?
I love this. You've just thrown a lot at me. There's so many places we could go with that. So Norbert Elias, Swiss-German sociologist, he told a story about civilization and the rise of liberalism and liberal democracy. He said that in the Middle Ages, he says we were vulgar and crass and barbaric. We would, belch and fart in public with no shame, and we would defecate in the corner of a banquet hall. And that he says people in the Middle Ages were really prone to violence and to just outbursts, and that just a calm meeting at the dinner table or a meeting could just erupt in violence and murder at any moment. And then he says it was the rediscovery of classical Greco-Roman texts during the Renaissance period, where people across Europe began to become re-enchanted with this idea of civilization and the conduct befitting a member of civilization and the civis. And so what does it mean to be civilized, and how might we conduct ourselves in a way that is conducive to a member of civilization? And Elias says that there was this vast and wide rediscovery of manners and etiquette and social control. That's really the key there. That so impulse control, rather, that we're not going to just be defined by our passions and what we and our emotions in a given moment. And this is like the invention of the fork and manners and elaborate rituals of the courts of Europe. And he says that this individual social control, this individual level self-control, that is what allowed for the rise of peace and prosperity, and like that self-governance allowed for the classical liberal democratic project to arise. And in my book, I talk about that there are two social contracts. We're familiar with the traditional social contract between citizen and sovereign, that we go from a state of nature into civil society, surrender certain rights, and receive certain protections from the sovereign. And that's the traditional social contract that Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau give us, and others unpack, like Spinoza. But there's also a vertical social contract between citizens. And sometimes that vertical social contract is governed by laws. Far more often, it's governed by social norms. People choosing to voluntarily restrain themselves for the sake of others and for the sake of society and living well together in civilization. So Elias tells this story of the history of civilization and liberal democracy through the lens of manners and social norms. And his hero here is also a hero in my book and a hero in my life in general. His name's Erasmus of Rotterdam. He's kind of lost to history because he's this unsung hero of moderation. So scholars like to say that he laid the egg of the Protestant Reformation that Martin Luther hatched. So he was Catholic. He never left the Catholic Church, but he had many criticisms of the Catholic Church. He famously translated a Greek New Testament that showed many errors in the Latin Vulgate, the commonly used version of the Bible that was used by Catholicism during this day. So he was not beloved by Catholics. And he was way too ironic. He was way too peace-loving and friendly. And he just he didn't want to get in fights with anyone. And Luther was very belligerent and, especially near the end of his life, got in fights with everyone. And they had a very, very famous falling out. But he never was radical enough to start his own tribe. Like he didn't leave the church and start his own community. And so he's kind of lost to history today because he never left the church. So he's not claimed by Protestants because he was not claimed by Protestants because he never left. He didn't leave the church, and he's not claimed by Catholics because he was critical of Catholicism. So he's kind of lost to history. But he was this unsung hero of moderation that is worth remembering for many reasons. But Erasmus wrote this book called A Handbook on Manners for Children, and Elias, in his story of civilization and rise of liberal democracies, pinpoints Erasmus's book, which was this international bestseller across Europe, translated into every European language, as the origin of this reinvention of manners and an attention to social control and modulating our behavior in ways great and small when we were with others. Erasmus's book, this Handbook on Manners, is the only book that I'm aware of that organizes manners according to body part. Like he has a chapter on the eye, is a chapter on on the nose, and it's just very funny. He's peculiarly against winking. He's like, that's the prerogative of a tuna fish, not befitting of a of a member of civilization. But I will say I love his final mandate, his final maxim in his book on manners. He says that I think really embodies kind of the ethos of true civility. He says, readily ignore the faults of others and avoid falling short yourself, which I think is that kind of sums up like we're today, especially, but it's like, again, the human condition. We're so quick to point the finger, right? What did Christ say? Like, why are you pointing at the speck in your brother's eye when you have the log in your own? It's because it's easier. It feels nicer to point at the speck in our brother's eye. And that I think is so emblematic of our moment today. Like if we're blaming others and pointing out and criticizing the faults of those around us, then we're okay for just a moment. The spotlight is not on us. And I think that it's so fun that Erasmus gets to this idea in the human condition. He counters that tendency that we still struggle with today. He says, readily ignore the faults of others and avoid falling short yourself. Just like, turns this ethos of blame and shame in our own moment totally on its head. And I think that's very much an idea. And he's a person we need today.
When I was, in my book about Suicide of the West, I took this position that basically what I call the miracle, liberal democratic capitalism, whatever you want to call it. I call it a miracle because we don't know where it comes from. We don't know why it happened. If it was natural, it would have happened sometime earlier in the evolutionary record. And but I say it starts in England. And the problem is there are a bunch of people who claim, no, it really starts in Holland. And I always make a joke about how if there are any Dutch jingoists out there, we can have this argument later. And I get this feeling that you're on Team Holland from all this Erasmus stuff, which it makes me want to fight. But so let's move towards the present moment a little bit. I'm inclined to say that things are ruder today in the sense that, God, there's this guy, Wayne. It'll come to me. unlike you, I'm old, and my brain, when the second I try to remember something that I have on the tip of my tongue, it's like when you lose something in the space between the console and your car seat. When you reach for it, you actually push it further away. Yeah, you have to like not look at it, and it'll come back out of your head.
And then it'll come back and wake you up at night.
Exactly. Yeah. Wayne, it's not Appleby. Anyway, he has this definition of rhetoric, which is that rhetoric is the art of probing what we think we ought to believe. And the way manners and politeness and civility are discussed today, I agree with you that it's entirely possible. Like you watch Deadwood and you're like, well, that wasn't a very polite or mannered society. Things might have been ruder in the past, but you didn't have a lot of people attacking the ideal of not being rude. You didn't have people attacking the ideal of kindness, of attacking the ideal of civility, right? So like there's a difference. I'm one of these guys, I write this column every 5 years or so in defense of hypocrisy, because hypocrisy at least points to what an ideal is. No one ever, like, as my friend Ramesh Ponnuru wrote years ago, when Hugh Hefner took his kids out of the Playboy Mansion to raise them, no one criticized him for not living down to his standards, right? We have, hypocrisy is the tribute vice pays to virtue, and that it acknowledges that there's a standard. And we live in a society now that hates hypocrisy more than it hates the standards themselves, right? And so we have this culture which praises authenticity and says it is better, like the glutton who says gluttony is bad is a worse person than the glutton who says everyone should be a glutton, because at least that person's consistent. And like I don't give a lot of parenting advice because I don't think I have the authority or the position to do it. My kid's great, but I think there's luck as much as anything else. But the one thing I always tell people is parents who are terrified of being hypocrites are terrible parents. Like part of being a parent is being a hypocrite. And what I mean by that is like if you had you have these parents who say, well, I did drugs in high school, so like, who am I to tell my kid? And it's like, you're their parent. That's who you are. And like the whole point of being a parent is to like learn some lessons from your own life and want something better for your kid. And so you set rules that maybe you wouldn't have followed when you were their age, but that's why they're good rules. And so today in society, whether it's like the Steve Bannon crowd or all the sort of post-liberal left that gets a free pass for their post-liberalism, the Code Pink people, the pro-Hamas people tearing down posters of kidnapped babies. I don't think there has been such a concerted war on the concepts of civility and decency, except for a brief period in the 1960s in American history. And so I do think in that sense, things are worse. But like, I'm kind of curious, where do you think this moment comes from? And like, other than reviving this history, what do we do about it?
I think you're absolutely right that we live in this moment where the stakes feel particularly high, and we feel that we hear that rhetoric, that sort of apocalyptic rhetoric across the political spectrum. People saying the other side is so bad and so wrong, so evil, and they're a threat to our existence, and we need to be willing to do or say anything in order to win. It's a sort of high stakes mentality. It's the same mentality in times of war, right? Like kill or be killed. And that we see this across history and culture, the temptation to dehumanize the other, the opposition, the person we disagree with, so that we feel more justified in doing or saying whatever is necessary to win. And that is exactly when we need civility most, when we have to maintain the dignity, the personhood, the bare minimum of respect of the other that we owe them just by virtue of our shared dignity, our shared moral status as members of the human community. It's precisely in times of war, precisely in the time of high stakes elections. Another thing I would say, and I get this from Dr. King, who in turn got it from Socrates. Socrates says that virtue is its own reward. Virtue is a well-ordered soul. It's a well-proportioned soul where one's loves and passions are rightly ordered, and it's a well-ordered. A society of well-ordered souls where the head, reason, love of wisdom rules the passions, restrains the passions through thumos or courage. That's what a well-ordered individual soul is. And a society of well-individual souls produces a just society. Plato says that a society is the soul writ large. So Socrates says that virtue is its own reward because it's a healthy soul. Vice is its own punishment because it's sickness of the soul. So when we see people, being malicious and vicious, that is a symptom of an unhealthy soul. And those people don't deserve our scorn. They deserve our compassion, because whether they realize it or not, when they're hurting others, they are hurting themselves too. Dr. King, in his letter from Birmingham jail, borrows this idea. And he talks about how segregation is mutually harmful. He says segregation, dehumanizing another human being by making them feel inferior through laws and institutions and social norms. It harms, obviously, the segregated by giving them a false sense of inferiority. It also harms the segregator by giving them a false sense of superiority. And that's actually where the title of my book, The Soul of Civility, comes from, because and I borrow this idea that just as incivility is mutually harmful and mutually deforming of the human soul, the spirit in both parties, civility is mutually ennobling. And I think people insufficiently appreciate that when we harm others, when we adopt this high stakes mentality where we're willing to do anything, step on anyone, punch anyone, own the libs to get ahead, that we insufficiently appreciate that we debase ourselves too. We dehumanize ourselves. We become, as we exercise cruelty and exert power over others, we become less human and less humane. But conversely, when we're gracious, kind, hospitable, when we act in the tradition of beneficence towards others, we affirm their humanity, we uplift them, and we ennoble ourselves as well. It's mutually beneficial as well. Happy to talk about Albert Schweitzer too, if you want to, about civilization. I know that's something you care about. We can go wherever you want to go.
Yeah. So, just some cleanup operation stuff from my own, because part of the problem of having a podcast where a lot of people have read stuff that I've written is that people say, "How come you didn't?" Blah blah blah. Because they know where my positions are on things, and so I have to anticipate criticism from people. One, we don't have to get into it, but in defense of Samuel Johnson, because I am pro-patriotism, and earlier you said that I would agree with him. I'm pro-patriotism, anti-nationalism. Johnson was basically saying that specifically about William Pitt, who was, he was basically saying, he wasn't saying patriotism, qua patriotism bad. He was saying that if all you have left to argue is patriotism, you don't have any other good arguments. That's why it's the last refuge. But the more important point is, because I have been carrying receipts on Gandhi for a long time, and there are very few podcasts that you will go on where you'll hear anti-Gandhi talk. On the big picture, Gandhi was right. Gandhi was an interesting dude. I always encourage people to read more Paul Johnson on Gandhi, but he was a little too obsessed with his own bowel movements. But the more important point is that he and he also let his wife die, saying that she shouldn't take Western medicine, but then he took it when he got sick. And Gandhi also, so one of the problems I have with, and this is more of a foreign policy point than a domestic policy point, but we tend to do a lot of mirroring of our own culture. And we think that because we're a good and decent culture, other countries necessarily have good and decent cultures too, and that they see moral and ethical issues the same way. And, Orwell's really great about this. Orwell points out that if the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany had any Gandhis, we have no idea. because they were killed in the middle of the night along with their families. And Gandhi used nonviolence in part because he recognized that it would be a successful strategy on British people, because British people have, for all the faults of the British Empire, and there were many, they're a good and decent liberal people with rightly formed consciences, and exposing them to their own barbarity, their own dehumanizing barbarity towards other people, is a way to get them to stop the barbarity. And but Gandhi, he never said to, his advice to the British in response to Nazi aggression was that they should just surrender the island to the Nazis, but keep their principles. His advice to the Jews was that the Jews should just commit mass suicide rather than surrender to the Nazis. Menachem Goldberg, not the best advice, in my opinion. And the reason why I just think it's relevant to bring it up now is that, one, I think it's important to take away a little of the sainthood from Gandhi and put a little of the decency on the British, that for Gandhi's tactical genius about picking this policy was in recognizing the basic decency of the British people. And we're living in this moment with an enormous amount of, the technical word for it in the social science is bullshit, about settler colonialism and all of this kind of stuff vis-a-vis Israel. And it's just worth pointing out that if the Palestinians had adopted a policy of Gandhi-ish or Martin Luther King style peaceful nonviolence, Israelis would have climbed out of their tanks, right? I mean, the Israelis would be total suckers for peaceful nonviolence. They're not suckers for people who cut off the heads of their babies and rape, teenagers. And I think that this is one of these things that gets lost because we teach people not to be very patriotic in this country anymore and not to have any pride in our nation. And one of the reasons why we've gotten dehumanized is we tell people that our country is a bad country, that our institutions are bad institutions, that our history is something to be ashamed of, that we've never taken the high road, when in fact, despite all of our flaws, and they are many, starting with slavery, it was the hypocrisy of slavery that was its undoing, because it didn't conform with America's highest principles. And teaching people that we are, in fact, a decent country and should be a decent country is really freaking important, because if you don't teach people that, you get people on the left and the right saying decency is surrendered to the other people. It's for suckers. And that's sort of the essence of a lot of the Trumpism stuff. Sorry for the rant, but I just want to get
No. Can we go on a tiny rabbit hole? Because you said this show is pro rabbit hole. So I love how you, I have this idea. I just want to affirm a sort of mental framework and an approach that you used with Gandhi and the British Empire for a moment. I have this idea in the book called Unbundling. And it's a mental framework where we see the part in light of the whole. We see the good alongside the bad in a person, in a nation, in a story. Our moment now, it's not a surprise. Like it's anti-nuance, right? Everything's good or evil, right or wrong. But when in reality, like we're both and as human beings, right? We have a little bit of good, a little bit of bad in all of us. And we live in this era of strange perfectionism where we expect everyone to like come out fully formed in their beliefs and perfect, like never making a mistake, never erring ever. And so I unpack this idea of unbundling people, seeing this is like a manifestation of this is cancel culture. Like we capture someone at their worst, saying something thoughtless, unkind, doing something careless. We capture it on video. We plaster it all over the internet. And we destroy them, and they're no longer welcome in polite society. They're fired from their job. They're alienated. We tell them that they're worthless because I've done this one thing that we can all like feel good about ourselves for a moment, and seeing that at least we're not doing that. And unbundling people is again. What was seeing the mistake, the shortcoming, in light of the irreducible dignity and worth as human beings. Alexander Pope said, "To err is to be human. To forgive is to be is divine." And that we are all going to make mistakes. We're all going to have shortcomings. And what does it look like especially when it comes to others in our own moment? And I think that to see the part and light of the whole. But I think what's interesting is, we have this, you shared things about, it goes both ways. Like you shared things about Gandhi that I didn't know, for example, his obsession with his fecal matter, or, other flaws about him. But like I think it's healthy to say that even the people we reify in society had faults or eccentricities that we can be like, okay, that's bizarre, as opposed to engaging in this hero worship. But we're actually not allowed to do that. We have this strange like mental dualism where, again, it's like, right or wrong, good or evil. Like this person thinks this one thing, okay, they're good. This person did this one thing, okay, they're bad. As opposed to, it's so essentializing of the dignity and beauty and diversity of the human personality. And what does it look like to be curious instead about the fullness of who we are? Like a person holds a view on something. What experiences have they had in life that led them to have those views? Like we're all infinitely complex. So I want to just affirm that way of thinking. Like,
yeah, no, you raise a point that is one of my great peeves. Is like, I think Martin Luther King was absolutely incandescently morally correct about the need to judge people by the contents of their character rather than the color of their skin. And it's really funny how a lot of left-wingers, sort of particularly on the black left, get very annoyed by conservatives celebrating that part of Martin Luther King's thought. And they say, well, you should celebrate the whole man, and he was also a socialist and an anti-imperialist and this thing. And it's like, well, maybe I just think he was right about this thing and not necessarily entirely right about these other things. I mean, there are things that there are lots of things where like people think I'm very right about X, but very wrong about Y. There's no transitive property that says, because I say 2 + 2 is 4, that means when I say, the square root of pi is a duck, that doesn't have to mean that like if one is right, they're both right. I mean, I can be wrong about something and people can be flawed. There's a moral theologian guy, it was a Jewish ethics professor in Boston or at UMass or something, I can't remember where, but he had this great line talking about the hypocrisy thing where apparently he was a huge philanderer in his own private life, but he taught ethics and morality. And someone asked him about the disconnect. And he said, look, the sign pointing to Boston doesn't have to go there. And all he meant by that is that you can point out certain truths while still being a flawed human being. And
right.
And similarly, you can point out the flaws of other human beings without undermining some of the truths that they illuminated.
Yes. No, it's a great point. I have a whole chapter in my book on integrity and why civility supports integrity. The Etymology of Integrity, it speaks to like structural integrity, like all parts of the self making sense together, like inner and outer corroborating one another. And it's interesting because a moment ago you mentioned hypocrisy a few times. You've mentioned the cult of authenticity in our moment right now. I actually disambiguate hypocrisy from inauthenticity. So hypocrisy comes from the Greek word for hypokrisis, which means play acting or pretense. And it's when, and I define hypocrisy as when the inner and the outer, like inner motivations and outer conduct, there's a disconnect there for self-serving purposes. For example, your boss comes into work and you say, oh, your haircut looks great, when you secretly hate it. Because why do you do that though? Because your performance review is later that week. You're trying to, preemptively ingratiate yourself to him before performance review, right? So that's hypocrisy. It's disconnect between inner motives and outer conduct for the sake of self. And I distinguish between that and inauthenticity, which is disconnect between inner motives and outer conduct for the sake of others. For example, you come home after a long day of work and, or I do, and I'm like annoyed at my husband for doing something, but I bite my tongue. Like I don't say something. I don't just like let him have it. I don't, say whatever's on my mind that I want to say because I'm frustrated or annoyed at him or at the world. Why? Because I love him, and it's for the sake of the relationship, right? Like, so my inner self, my inner motives, my inner disposition really wants to just like let loose and vent my spleen, but I'm going to restrain that. Like it's a disconnect between inner conduct and inner disposition to outer conduct for the sake of relationship, for the sake of marriage, for the sake of the human social project of flourishing with others. And I think that's interesting and helpful that also civility fosters that integrity, that all parts of the self making sense together, that even in that inauthenticity, even when there is that disconnect between inner and outer, because it's for the sake of others, of flourishing with others, that's aligned with our values, with our higher values of restraining the self for the sake of the fragility of democracy and life with others.
So we don't have a lot of time left, and I don't want to keep you too long, but you worked in the Trump administration under Betsy DeVos. I'm suspecting, I don't know where your stance is on Trump or any of these things, but I'm suspecting, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that you'd think it was not particularly helpful that in a recent speech, he talked about how he was going to root out the vermin in our society and eliminate them. It seems to me that runs that pets the cat backwards on the whole civility thing.
That's horrible. I did not know about that recent speech. I tend to be a net, not consumer of social media, whatever, if there's a word for that. Like I tend to read old books. I try to not read the news, not read the commentary. So that's horrible. I mentioned Trump one time in my book. It's 3/4 of the way through. Earlier versions of the manuscript didn't mention him at all. And I had many people say that's just too conspicuously absent. Like you have to at least mention it. So I was like, fine. And the reason I didn't was because, Trump's like a Rorschach test. Like, it's like, the moment I mention him or anyone mentions him, like all they focus on is that one thing. And I just didn't want, my book's not a political tell-all. It's so far from it. Like I wrote my book in hopes of it being this tool of healing, of reconciliation. I wanted it to be a humanistic manifesto in these very divided times of like the gift of being human and affirming our common humanity in this very broken and divided moment. So I was very hesitant to mention Trump, but I do. And in one paragraph, I say, there's no question he coarsened our public discourse and made this challenge to civility and doing life with others, flourishing across difference, worse, but he did not cause this problem. Like he's, a symptom, not the cause. And the problem with people that claim that it's Donald Trump or it's Facebook and Twitter, it's Mark Zuckerberg, it's some like big bad, that it cheapens the problem. Like again, this is a timeless human problem. This is a problem of the human condition, it's the tension between our social and our selfish natures. It's a problem of, as Blaise Pascal said, the greatness and wretchedness of man. That's the human condition. We're capable of altruism and generosity and benevolence, capable of barbarism and monstrosity, committing atrocities towards our fellow human being. That's one thing I wanted to mention when you had mentioned the Treaty of Westphalia, that we take for granted peace and prosperity today, like conflict and war and that is the norm. That's the default of human history. Like and that we live in relative times of peace and prosperity. And yes, we're witnessing atrocities and barbarism happening in Israel and the Middle East right now. And just untold human suffering. And we're always scandalized and we're always caught off guard when that happens. And that's a privilege. That's one like really beautiful and wonderful thing of our moment that conflict is not our norm, at least comparatively to most of human history. So, all that to say, yes, no question that Trump has not made this problem better. In fact, has made it worse and continues to. But people that claim that he's the problem, like the moment he disappears from public life, there will still be this problem. So if we misidentify the cause, we won't accurately think clearly about meaningful solutions. And in terms of solutions, they start with us. My theory of social change is individual. It's at the micro individual person to person level. You're, squarely a member of the intelligentsia, Jonah. I didn't write this book for you. Thanks for having me on your show, but I wrote this book for America. I wrote this book for as I hope for, everyday Americans to reclaim their agency and their sphere of influence and say, I'm going to be a part of the solution. I can't control what's happening in Washington, what the tweet of the day is, what's going on around the world, but I'm going to make myself and my community better. I stumbled upon this revolution of people healing our social world when we fled Washington, D.C. I call myself a refugee from federal government and moved to Indianapolis, Indiana. And my first friend in Indiana, her name was Joanna. She came up to me after church one day and said, "Hi, I'm Joanna. Would you like to porch with us sometime. And I never heard the word porching used as a verb before, but we went to her home. We didn't have any friends in town. So we went to her home that afternoon, and I realized that she's staging this subversive, quiet revolution, front porch revolution from her great big front veranda. She had curated people across race, across politics, across class, across geography, just to inhabit a shared space. And again, she realized that she can't change what's happening, across the world or even at City Hall down the street. But she's reclaiming ownership and her duty and civic responsibility, and saying, I'm going to make my community better, my family stronger, and I'm gonna control what I can control. So it's not even about the porch. I got a Novak fellowship to study this phenomenon across the country, that there are people like Joanna using coffee shops, using their front stoop, using their front lawn. They're creating a space where, again, to allow people to be seen and known and loved in this time of division and profound brokenness. And that's radical, that's revolutionary, and that grassroots, that micro, it can't be scaled. No public leader can come in and mandate a porching policy. It's voluntary, and that's what's going to heal our deeply divided and broken world.
But no, so it's funny. So this podcast is called The Remnant, and it's
Isaiah's job.
Directly a reference to Isaiah's Job, the essay by Albert J. Nock in the 1930s. And what you're describing is basically a big chunk of what he means by the remnant. It's this sort of substratum of decent, right-thinking people upon which a society sustains itself and could potentially renews itself. And it's very weird how much of your argument dovetails the argument in my book about how, human nature is in many ways inherently corrupting. And that when we give in too much to it, that's when we get into trouble. When we try to channel it and hone it and buttress the better aspects of it, that's when good things can happen. And part of my objection to the cult of authenticity stuff is people thinking that the highest source of moral authority is our gut. And that if you just go with your gut and go with your instincts, you can't go wrong. And the story of humanity for 250,000 years is the story of societies going with their guts and killing a lot of people. And you should actually sort of use a higher part of your anatomy to sort of figure out a lot of things. Anyway,
when you quoted Arendt, I love that quote from her. Anyone who says human nature is inherently good has never had children, right? Like Rousseau, he was a bad parent, he abandoned his kids at his orphanage. Like, I would not take parenting advice from Rousseau. I might take it from you. So if you have parenting advice, I think I might take it from you, Jonah, but I would not take it from Rousseau. Human nature is, it's rough. And that's what this project of civilization is. The metaphor of the garden is central to my book. I don't know if you, you had a copy of the book. The olive grove is the oldest cultivated crop, in the olive tree rather. And that is, that's apropos to what this project of civilization is. It's never a foregone conclusion. Every generation has to cultivate its next generation, and so that these values can be passed on, so that civilization can sustain, that our institutions can be sustained. I say that civilization is a garden, and all we can control is our individual plot of land, and we each have to decide, what are we going to plant in our individual plot of land? Are we going to plant seeds of charity and grace and kindness and beneficence, which produce regenerative crops and beautiful flowers and produce abundance that create beauty for the plots of land around us and contribute to the garden of civilization, this flourishing and diverse ecosystem of birds and bees? Or are we going to plant weeds, seeds of weeds and thistle beds, and that are corrosive, that zap nutrients from the soil and invade surrounding crops? That all we can control is our individual plot of land, but that we each have a role to play in supporting this joint garden, this joint project of civilization and living well with others. And so that's very much the theory of social change in my book. We can't control what other people are plotting and cultivating in their little plots of land. We can only control ours, but that what we do in ours has big consequences for our democracy, for our society in general.
All right. Alexandra Hudson, thank you so much for being on. I really appreciate it. And I hope to have you back sometime.
Thank you so much, Jonah. Really appreciate you having me.